Hello, everybody, and welcome to Open Source in Business. This is a speaker series that takes a broad view on the role of open source in industry. And this week, I'm joined by Larry Gritz from Sony Picture Imageworks and Carol Payne from Netflix. Thank you for joining me. And we're going to talk about the ways that open source has transformed the film industry over the last 20 years or so. So to get us started, Larry and Carol, Larry, can you introduce yourself and explain a little bit of how you got into the film industry and how you got started on open source?
Sure. My name is Larry Gritz. I am at Sony Pictures Imageworks, which is a small subsidiary of a subsidiary of the big Sony, and we work on visual effects and feature animation. So we do a combination of the sort of live action visual effects that you see, and also complete films, both for our own company, but also work for hire for other studios entirely. I've been in the industry for decades, and I come from a traditional computer science background, but I'd always been really interested in film and photography, and somehow the time that I was a PhD student, digital computer graphics was really starting to become a thing, and those lines just kind of converged in a way that propelled me forward.
Carol?
And when I started, there was really not a lot of open source to speak of, but I maybe 10 years ago, the industry turned, and I was kind of in the right place at the right time to have my hands in that.
Awesome.
Yeah. And yeah, I am Carol Payne. I work for Netflix on our creative technology team. My background is color science and imaging for visual effects. And so, yeah, I came in through the visual effects industry, and now I've worked at Netflix for 2 years. And so many, we'll talk about it today, but yeah, so many of the tools that we use for me to be able to do my job are open source now, in one way, shape, or form. And it's gotten me very involved, and the opportunities within that are only growing. And so really excited to talk about my love for open source. I think it's the future of our industry. So.
And so you've been in the industry, Carol, for about a decade, right?
Not quite, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe to take us on a kind of a little bit of a background of the evolution from, because I had a little bit of familiarity because I used to work on a project which has been used in the film industry, Cinepaint, or its parent, the GNU image manipulation program. I used to work on that project. That was the first open source project I worked on. And at the time, which was right around 2000, the reputation was that like the film industry was all proprietary tools, that it was all proprietary hardware platforms. And then over the course of the next few years, it seems like a lot of the file formats and the tooling and the infrastructure that's used to render films has become open source dominated. Larry, can you talk a little bit about the evolution in that period and how that change happened?
Sure. So when I started working professionally, the first film that I worked on for real was the first Toy Story movie. So this kind of dates me. And in those days, we were all, working on these big, expensive SGI workstations, and all of the software was either, kind of early stage, very expensive commercial apps, or custom tooling. We all had big software departments and had to write things from scratch because there weren't even commercial apps at the time. And open source was kind of not on our radar very much. And towards the late 90s, as the 90s closed and the early 2000s started, there was a transition, more towards, beefed up PCs as the basic hardware platform on people's desks. And with, the graphics cards had come a long way. They were starting to get good enough for us to use. And of course, because we were all used to Unix varieties, we were running Linux on these machines. So of course, with Linux introduced, open source was something that we were at least all aware of and dependent on as users, and that was a big foot in the door. But the visual effects specific software itself was mostly not until the big breakthrough for us was in 2003, I believe, Industrial Light and Magic open sourced a project called OpenEXR. And that was a particular image file format that solved some specific problems for the industry that the other formats didn't do. And instead of keeping that closed by open sourcing that, it actually became very widely used and embedded in all of the apps that we use. And that really set the stage for other people seeing, oh, like not only do we see that this is acceptable, but it's a way for us to accomplish our goals by getting the technologies that we develop and we think is the right way to do something into all of the commercial apps that we use also, because they're gonna, if you give them the piece that lets them implement what you want as an open source project, they'll use it if it's good. So it's a way to infiltrate those products as well.
There was something we discussed when we were preparing this session, as you mentioned, that I thought was really interesting, was the way that the labor market around the film industry changed, also kind of activated and enabled open source and like file interchange as a key capability. So can you talk about the way that, technology used to be a kind of a key differentiator between studios, and how studios would make films from soup to nuts to now different sections are being farmed out?
Right. So there's two interesting things that happened, I would say mostly between 15 and 10 years ago. One is the labor issue that you mentioned, is that, the margins in this business are small. And so there was a big transition for most of the artists working on the films, essentially being permanent hires, to almost all of them across the industry being hired for a particular show. And, when that show wraps, you hope there's another one coming up behind it so you can just transfer them from one to the other, but that doesn't always happen. And so the labor force, started to be much more about moving from company to company with each project, and you always hope you get them back. And so that definitely set the stage for, there's a lot of overhead when someone comes in. If you have to train them up on all these proprietary only tools, and then they leave and they kind of resent the fact that you've filled their heads, with information they can't use anywhere else. And so more reliance on both standardized commercial apps, but also on these open source projects kind of means a lot more people and knowledge portability from project to project and company to company, which is kind of necessary. And the other thing is like these big film projects themselves. It used to be more that a big facility like mine or like ILM would take on essentially an entire movie. And that was pretty standard until about 10 years ago. And it's actually quite rare now. Even the big places, they might, instead of getting, all 1,800 shots for a movie, they might get 300 or 400, but each of 5 big places will get 300 or 400. And so part of that is because the production schedule is compressed and they're doing this work in parallel at different facilities. And so that means a lot more collaboration is necessary.
And so obviously you need to share files between different studios, and that's where the open file formats kind of came into their own, I guess, right? Right.
Yeah.
And
I came in,
Carol, you've worked on some of those file formats, and I was gonna.
Yeah. That's a lot of time. Like when I came into the industry and I started as a technical assistant at ILM, and a lot of the stuff that we were doing at that time was developing pipelines around how do we share files between vendors, and even between like subcontractors for a couple different things at ILM. We would like send shots out for certain tasks and ingest them back in for others and stuff like that. And it was a lot of the things that I was working on, and it's how I got introduced to OpenColor.io, which is an open source project under the Academy Software Foundation, because we had to have a way to send what is the color pipeline for this project out to companies, and tell them what we'd done and what we did and how to replicate. So that was a big one. A lot of the other big ones on that, ACES falls under that too, the Academy Color Encoding System, which is the other big open source project I work on. But you have to have a way to say how this image is encoded and have different facilities and different programs know exactly what to do with that. So it's between software packages and it's between different companies too. And so it's both of those things that intertwine together. It's like that interoperability that becomes a big factor in why open source has started to play a huge part.
And so, Carol, you came into the digital media industry through a Bachelor of Fine Arts, as you mentioned, film and digital media. Can you talk a little bit about, like, were you introduced to open source tooling in college? Like, how has the training around digital media evolved?
It's funny because I look back on it now, and yes, I was introduced to it in college, like things like using open source tools like Blender and FFmpeg and OpenEXR and all of these things that you use in college. And my computer science classes, they were running on Linux terminals, and things like that, where all of those things. But it's interesting of like the education factor around what is open source and why is it so important, and what are you, when you're using these tools, what's actually different about them than a piece of software that you buy or a piece of like those things. That concept wasn't something that I was educated around or that became clear to me until I started working in the industry. And you start to deal with the differences between that and why, when one is valued and benefits over the other, and to start to really make those connections about how the ecosystem actually works. Mm-hmm. That knowledge didn't come until later. But yeah, I was messing around with FFmpeg and I just thought it was cool that I could get this stuff for free and play around with it. And there was no connection about why that was the case until I was actually working in the industry.
So you mentioned the Academy Software Foundation. So I came across, open source and film essentially through the Academy Software Foundation, which I think started 2-3 years ago.
Yeah.
But the Academy has been doing a lot around organizing open source projects for quite a while. Larry, can you talk about like how the industry organized itself around open source and open source efforts over the last few years?
Yeah. So just just to clarify terminology, like this is the same Academy when we talk about the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the people that hand out the Oscars, and industry think of them only as like, okay, they're giving awards to actors or whatever, but the sciences part has always been important to them also. So there's a Science and Technology Council. They do a lot of work in areas from sort of film preservation to underlying technology, setting standards, and one thing they did as the industry began to get critically dependent on these open source packages, there was sort of a recognition of doing some investigation into like just how deep embedded are we, and what's the risk profile of that, right? Because we already had a couple of cases where some particular packages became pervasively used critical infrastructure for a lot of these studios, and then maybe the company that started them didn't have the resources to put on it that it once did, or the founder of that project, the main developer, left the industry or wanted to work on something else, and suddenly that was no longer just a risk to the one company developing that software like it would be if it was an internal project, but suddenly everyone's sharing the risk. So there was this idea that maybe as an industry we should convene a group to look and see like how big is this problem, and do we need to find some other way to ensure that these projects have a long-lasting home and good support. And in the process of that investigation that lasted a couple of years, they decided to make a software foundation, and that was a collaboration between the Academy and the Linux Foundation. And so the Academy Software Foundation is 2 or 3 years old now. Yeah, I mean it's both new, but it's also had so much traction in the industry that we can't even imagine living without it at this point. And so it has become the home for a lot of these foundational projects and a basis for just a ton of collaboration, both in terms of the code and other things between all these companies that used to not talk to each other too much. And now we have this way to do things that benefit the whole group, which is great.
Thank you. It's one of the things that you mentioned is that like the Academy Software Foundation, part of the reason why it was created was risk mitigation around single points of failure on vendors. How are like projects like OpenEXR have been around for over 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to the ASF, how was that? How did people work together on the software? Was it run by single studios, or did people not work together? Was all of the burden being taken by one vendor? How did that work?
Yeah,
it was pretty. It was pretty single source, right? So even if the project was open source, a lot of these projects were started by a single studio. Whether or not they were open source from the beginning or not, it doesn't really matter. But a lot of the time, before the Academy Software Foundation, they were run by that single studio, by engineers and people in that studio. There are a couple exceptions, and as time goes on, things change. Like ILM did the initial open source of OpenEXR, and then there was substantial contributions a while after from Weta Digital that started a lot of that collaboration. But it does vary, and they do kind of tend to stay in their home studio.
In almost all of these projects, they were always open to outside contribution, and in some cases, in practice, took them. But they tended to be they were regarded as still being run, and managed by its original sponsor and home, and usually lived in that company's GitHub accounts. So it was pretty clear who it belonged to in some sense.
Right.
And the big change with the ASWF is now there's a neutral home for these, and a lot of these have made the transition to truly being an industry-wide collaborative project where there's no one clearly in charge. I mean, the group chooses their leaders, but it's not like one company, and it doesn't stick with them. It's a much more collaborative endeavor than it was even when they were open before. It's a whole new level now, just in the past couple of years.
And was that something that was consciously part of the bootstrapping of the Apache Software Fund, or not Apache, Academy Software Foundation? Excuse me, slip of the tongue.
Yeah, I mean, part of their mission statement was, make a neutral home for these. But I don't feel like we knew at the time just how far it was going to go. I think it happened very organically, but now it almost seems like we can't imagine it any other way. It's quite common now. There are these working groups that they have where even without a project, there's some topic that we know, is of technical importance to everyone, and we'll get people together through the foundation to kind of start mulling over, does there need to be a project? Is this a problem we all have, and we shouldn't all go off and solve it ourselves? We should do something together so that it's not all, everyone's burden redundantly.
Right.
And it's just become much more, not just accepted, but almost the default is hey, let's see if this is something where we can do it together instead of shouldering the entire cost ourselves. And it has just become much closer to the central way of thinking about some of these projects. I mean, not everything, a lot of we still do a ton of custom software development. There are a lot of things that are not appropriate to open source. And the main reason is just that a lot of the custom development we have is just stuff that's so particular to our way of doing things or other pieces of our pipeline that it almost wouldn't be valuable to anyone else. It's not worth the trouble. But sometimes we recognize things as oh, I know my place has to solve this problem, but also ILM has to solve the problem, and Netflix has to solve the problem, and Disney has to solve the problem. It's silly to all do it separately. Let's just talk about it.
Another thing I thought was interesting when we were talking about this is that ASWF is not just about technical collaboration, as you mentioned, but it even goes beyond industry-wide technical issues to some industry-wide structural issues, which, Carol, I think it brings us on nicely into one of the things that you're working on in the Software Foundation, which is diversity and inclusion, which is something that's been kind of front of mind in the film industry as well as in open source for a long time.
Yeah, it's a really, I feel like a confluence of many opportunities when we've got this foundation that is prioritizing a lot of open collaboration and things in a lot of ways. And they got started, and then a year or so in, the topic came up of what could we be doing to basically make this more inclusive for folks around the world, and encourage new contributions. Because honestly, when we look around the film industry and we look around open source software development, the demographics are still very shockingly similar, or not so shockingly similar, I guess. When you think about it, it's like open source should be open, and it should be open to anybody, and anybody should be able to contribute. But when you look at the demographics of people that are contributing, it is still predominantly white, predominantly male. So when you look at that, you're like, okay, well, something is not happening correctly. There's systemic issues here, just like there are anywhere else, even though theoretically anyone can join. So we're looking at, with the diversity inclusion group, working group, like Larry mentioned in the Software Foundation, we have working groups that aren't attached to specific projects that have tasks. And one of those for us is diversity and inclusion. And I co-lead that group with my old colleague from ILM, Rachel Rose, who is incredible. And we have we've got a great group of people. We've been working for not quite a year now on a lot of initiatives, both internal to the Academy Software Foundation, and the things like how do we as a foundation operate? Are we structurally set up to be the best inclusive place that we can be, from how we form our leadership teams to our documentation within our projects and within the foundation, the onboarding process. How easy is it to start contributing to one of these projects? We'll be continually working on that for a long time. And then the other side of it is the external outreach of, okay, so we're not having, a diverse group of people coming in and starting to contribute to these projects. Why? How can we outreach? How can we start to look at making the work that we're doing more well-known and more accessible to different groups of people? So we're doing some education outreach in the form of career webinars of like, here are all the technical careers that exist in the media and entertainment industry, and why they're cool, and how your computer science degree or your film degree or any type of engineering degree is 100% applicable. It's also applicable if you don't have a degree and you want to learn something new. There's so many ways to find something new that you're interested in and to learn about it. And open source and contributing to open source projects is a huge way that we would love to see utilized more, because it's a lot too about once you get in and start contributing to these projects, especially in the Academy Software Foundation. Currently, it's made up of all the top people in the industry working on these projects, and you get so much exposure and mentorship opportunities, and just opportunity to figure out and learn from people that have been, like Larry, that have been doing this for a long time, and want to share knowledge and want to build the team, so that we don't have the second part of it is, now we're in the Software Foundation, but the second part of this now too is growing that base of contributors, so that we still don't run into the, oh my gosh, what do we do when someone that's working on one of these tools moves industries? Because it still is a thing that we have to deal with. So, and
even outside open source, per se, like, we're always hungry to hire talented people, and we're in competition, almost less with each other than we are collectively, to hire people into the technical parts of the film industry versus, going to work for a bank or, Facebook or what, right? Like, we're competing with the whole tech industry too, for the same talent. And, if we look around and say, like, how can we, pull people in that are really talented? And if we look at the pool and say, like, hey, like, this doesn't look like the demographics of the world, that means, somebody talented that we should be hiring, like, they've been filtered out before they get to us, and we don't want that, right? So what can we do to sort of pull in all of the talented people, including from the corners that may have been overlooked before, because we've got no shortage of work to do for them.
That was actually that's connected to something that you mentioned, that you're looking for contributors to projects. I was wondering if you were looking more broadly for people to get into the film industry,
Yeah.
Starting even like, do you focus on using tools versus contributing to tools? Do you do training sessions around, building up a portfolio of work on, say, Blender is a project you mentioned earlier, to kind of showcase talents, or is that kind of out of scope for you right now?
Right now, it's out of scope. We're just getting started. We have a lot of things we would love to do, and obviously some trainings and things like that. We do have a couple programs. Like one of the things we're launching this summer is what we're calling our scholarship program, where we're going to let people who want to learn these skills apply for grants that will go towards online classes in a subject related to the film and media industry, hopefully, of their choice, so that they can start, take that. There's tons of great online classes out there that are accessible wherever you are in the globe. And that'll be accompanied with a mentor from someone that works in the Academy Software, an Academy Software Foundation project in some capacity, to be there as a resource, not necessarily a technical resource to help you with your class, because that's going to be all over the place, but a person to talk to that you can ask questions about your career development and what you're doing and what you're looking to achieve is more the type of mentorship we're talking about. So that's something we're doing because we don't have the resources or the ability. People have done it better before us of how to use Blender and how to make those types of things. So using our resources wisely, because at the end of the day, our first focus is the projects within the software foundation and getting a solid base there, because at the end of the day, we're a technical software development foundation. So we want to be smart about what we are good at, and then use other resources for the rest and make those connections. And a lot of that is just the connection building.
Right. There's a strong, window into the parts of these film companies that are solving the really technical problems and doing the software development. It's probably outside of our scope to be recruiting people for the artists departments, and they have well-established pipelines for that as well. And that's not going to be our strength, at least through the Academy Software Foundation. But yeah, on the technical side, one of the things that I especially like about these projects for recruiting is, you see how people work and interact and take criticism with code reviews and things. I can learn so much more about someone interacting with one of these projects than I could from an interview. And we have hired people who came to our attention, solely because they made interesting contributions to open source projects that we care about. And we've seen their work products. It's kind of a no-brainer that's the person that you want to hire, versus some unknown person where you're sort of trying to suss out what are they like, from a few interviews. Or, it's just so much better. You see their work, so it's a great way to recruit in that sense.
So I'm just want to point out that Jonas put a link to a list of more than 280 open source projects used in the creative industry. And I'm going to ask one of his questions. So specifically, how are companies working together to develop a project in common? Are there R&D teams sharing knowledge openly in the public, or is it more about, you use a project, a company, this is me ad-libbing, but you pick a project that nearly does what you want, and then you add a feature to do what you actually want for a specific film, and then that gets contributed back? How does that contribution process work?
It's both. It's all of the above. So yes, to answer the question of are we openly, the open source is the key. So the companies that are working on these and using them and deciding have to make a conscious decision to contribute this back out openly under what the open source licensing structure that says anybody can use this, and I can't put any limitations on that, basically. So that part is there, and that includes, the collaboration that comes along with how we think about thought processes and the meetings that we have, and the meeting notes are all publicly available. The meetings are open to anyone. You can come and join them whenever you want, and that's a really important part of what we're doing, and the decisions that you make as an individual. If you're not working for a company, you can still, join the meetings. And then and as a company that has decided to contribute to open source software.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Carol said about there's a range of how we interact with these projects, all the way from it's fine out of the box and we use an open source project like we use with a commercial app, and that's that. Nothing ever needs to be changed. And there are some where occasionally we'll see some way to make it better or to fix something, and we don't want to wait for the next version, and we'll fix it and contribute the fix back. But there are some where we're the in the origin of the project, either with one company or several of us collaboratively. It's constant active development. People work on it full time. And the organization varies from project to project. One thing that the Academy Software Foundation has brought to the table is just really good organization and sort of another level of openness, where the projects that have been adopted by the foundation, they have formal steering committees, and they have Zoom meetings on a regular basis to talk about the development plan and what they're doing, and they have elected chairs and sometimes chief architects and other positions. And yeah, I mean it's very much works like a little bit like a software company, except that people aren't all employed by the same company. Maybe Carol wants to talk a little bit about how OpenColor.io works, just sort of how the project dynamics worked, because I think that's one of the projects where it's kind of the most collaborative and has people from several companies all working together.
Yeah, OpenColor.io has been quite the journey. It was originally developed, Larry is well aware, at Sony Pictures Imageworks, and open source while it was there and hosted there, and then transferred to the Academy Software Foundation, and we released a version 1. I forget exactly when it was. It's been a while, but since then the project has kind of been it had been up until about 4 years ago a little dormant, and till the first version was incredibly useful, and it took a long time to get a lot of the industry software and the industry houses using OpenColor.io in general. And so there was a big transition period to using that as a way to describe your color pipeline. But it became to the point it was pretty ubiquitous, and then we started noticing there are some features that are missing. Such as in the version 1, a match between what you see in a CPU-based pipeline versus a GPU-based pipeline. The GPU is limited in a couple different ways that was pretty obvious. And so we started looking at these things, and Autodesk in particular was a company that was really looking at OpenColor.io as, they were having to support their own proprietary color solution in their software packages like Maya and Flame and a couple others. And then they were also supporting OpenColor.io because of industry needs and the need to be interoperable between a couple things. And that gets to be hard. And at some point, you start to make a decision, and a couple companies have done this. Nuke over the years did. The Foundry is another example that's had their own proprietary way of dealing with color and now supports OpenColor.io. And so you start to look at these things, and Autodesk made a decision to go all in on OpenColor.io, and so devoted a couple engineers, 3 full-time engineers, to working towards a version 2 of OpenColor.io. That just 4 years ago now. It's been a really long effort, and over the years, especially since the transfer and the start of the Academy Software Foundation, there's been an added on of a bunch of different companies jumping on to support those development efforts that were led by Autodesk. They've done a ton of work. But companies like, Imageworks still plays a big part. Netflix, my company, has jumped on board. ILM is on board. Weta Digital has jumped on and is contributing a lot of things, specifically like how we handle basic OCIO config generation of okay, so you have this library, but now how do you use it, and what are the baselines that people can jump off from? So there's lots of inroads of different people contributing to these projects, and it's been really cool to see all of that come together and happen in a way that was kind of unheard of 5 years ago. And it's resulted in the release of OCIO v2 in January. And we still have tons of work to do in getting it into software, and there's always going to be work to do. But it was a really like multi-company global effort to get it over the finish line.
Yeah. On OpenColor.io, also, it's not just the studios that are collaborating on this, but several of the software vendors who are competing with each other and sort of angling to like sell us stuff. They're basically just we made this space where everyone can get together and solve this big technical problem, and then that solution is going to go into all of these projects, both the commercial products and the studio written custom tools, just so that it works uniformly across all of those, and it just solves a ton of problems for everyone that way.
That's one of the things that's been interesting to me learning about this, the way the film industry has developed, is that, and you mentioned this in prep, is that you still have proprietary, in-house, and open source development, and they're actually even kind of intermixing a little bit, and you're seeing proprietary companies adopting open source libraries for certain file formats or certain parts of their pipeline. Can you talk a little bit about how? And I think this goes to the other question that Jonas asked, is like, how do you make those decisions around which to use, build versus buy versus share or develop, or however you want to talk about adopting an open source component?
Yeah, I mean, it's on a case-by-case basis. If there's, human time is the scarce resource in many ways. So if there is an affordable off-the-shelf solution that does what we want, like, we're happy to buy products like that's, we use a lot of commercial apps, and we use, and not just one, but I mean, kind of all of them, and which is part of what makes the need to have to be able to ship data, out of one app and into another, back and forth across several stages of production. Even if we weren't collaborating with other studios, there's that need to bridge different products from different vendors, and that's part of why a lot of these, standard formats and libraries are really helpful. There are, we look at each case individually in terms of, should we open source this project? And it's, there's a bunch of factors. Like, the interesting thing though is, if you'd asked us all, 10 years ago, we would have guessed, a lot of the time the answer would be no, because it's some secret piece of technology. We don't want our competitors to have this. And that used to be a little more true in the early days. And we came to the realization that that's not really the battlefield that we're competing on at all, to get these projects. Like, you can't, like, I wish the software I worked on was so important that we're winning and losing, $30 million, film deals because of, these lines of code. And that's just not how it works. It's infrastructure that we need to do the films, but that's not the thing that lets us, that makes or breaks whether we get the contracts. And so that kind of opens the door to think more creatively about, how do we use the scarce development resources that we have? And like I said before, like, a lot of the custom development we do wouldn't do anybody else any good to have, because it's just so particular to our way of working, and it's got tendrils into other parts of our pipeline. It's impossible to separate out, and it would be so much work to make it into the kind of general shape that would be useful to other people. It just isn't, we can't see any return on that investment.
Right.
But then there are other projects where we just know, like, oh, even in this form, it will be useful to other people, but also it will be more useful to us if we have that injection of ideas and expertise and use cases from other places. Like, it might be that Netflix needs to use a piece of software in a way that hasn't occurred to us yet, but by having them collaborate with us, even if they can't contribute the code, by using it and filing issues and participating in the steering of it, that may get us out ahead of a problem that, if they're facing it now, maybe we will in a couple of years. And that tends to make the software a lot stronger. And so we're on the lookout for projects that have those kinds of synergies. They don't all, most of them don't.
Yeah.
But the ones that do, we try to really jump on.
I think it's important to recognize that, open sourcing software isn't cost free, right? It's not just a case of putting the source code out there and magic will happen. that creating a community or creating like a successful open source project does involve an investment of time and energy.
Yeah. You'll also notice a lot of the successful open source projects in our industry, their file formats, their core libraries, their computational things,
right.
they're rarely end user facing apps with GUIs and stuff, because first of all, like supporting, end user artists is a lot harder than making a tool for other developers. But also, the studios tend to be really particular about exactly what sits in front of the artists and doing everything the way they want. It's harder to make everybody happy with an artist facing app than it is with a library that the developers in the other companies will know exactly how to use, but they don't necessarily, they'll reskin it to expose it to their artists. But it's harder to do that.
And that's true for software released by studios, but it's not necessarily true for open source in general. There are open source end user facing applications.
Certainly.
Yeah. It sort of depends. Like, you start to see these commonalities and these connection points between a lot of this work, particularly in the film and media industries, of things that everybody has to do and capitalize on those things and try and, like Larry was saying, look out ahead to things that we might not have thought of. And that's where a lot of this stuff kind of comes in, and empowering a lot of it for working for a big studio. Like, a lot of it is about empowering people to do the work without having to fight the technology so much and spend their resources redoing it every project, or when a new version of a software comes out, or something like that like disrupts the way that they need to work. We'd rather them spend their resources on what makes them special, which is how they do their work, and the work that you produce and the content that you're creating. There is kind of a line that is becoming clearer as we start to move along this open source road of what makes sense to have everyone do on at least a starting baseline of the same, and where you go from that is what makes your work shine,
But there were, like, in the past, there would have been studios who they were the best ones at, say, fire or water or hair or fur or whatever it is. Is that no longer the case? Are those kind of, or are those still
that's
different?
certainly still true, and that's part of how we do get work is the track record of the films we work on. And different studios are known for different things. Some might be the best at giant robots destroying buildings. A different one will do character animation. Like they do have their specialties, and that is part of how we get the work. And yeah, so that continues. Like, but a lot of that is because of the custom software, and a lot of that, but more of it is just because of the expertise and the pipeline. It's the processes, what people we've hired and what they're good at, what as a company we've learned to be able to execute well on. You can't be good at everything. And those things rarely boil down to using a particular library. Like, it's just vastly more complicated than that. So the infrastructure is much more interchangeable, but that doesn't mean that everybody is equally good at different types of high level work.
So I do want to go back to diversity and inclusion for just one more question, which is, you mentioned a lot about all of the meetings are in public. You have Zoom meetings where anybody's welcome to participate, etc. Are you also working as a foundation to enable people to contribute from different time zones with different languages, without access to technology, without access to the real-time Zoom meetings, and working on volunteer time, or is that something that's not front of mind right now?
I think it depends on the state of where each project is at. You'll see different levels of need based on the some projects are, they're just at different stages in development, and so I think that makes a big difference. So the Academy Software Foundation and the Linux Foundation in particular has a lot of great, baseline standards of accessibility and equity and things like that, as far as like how the meetings are structured and where the notes are kept and things like that. And beyond that, we do try to be as time zone friendly as we can. It's hard. I mean, especially it's been really funny the last couple, it happens once a year, around this time, twice a year, I guess, actually. Daylight savings makes everybody's life very, very hard. We just had this discussion in the Open Color AO steering committee meeting again, like New Zealand just changed and made everything difficult again. So it's constant, but the work is there. The acknowledgement is there. I think language is a thing that I would like to start looking more heavily at in the future. Everything is primarily, because software development is just primarily English based to the vast majority. But as we start to be more globalized and making this open and accessible, having at least documentation for things available, and having some ways to localize that too. I mean, you can kind of do it in browser, sort of, but having more intentionality around that, I think, is definitely something that I see in the future that could be a really great addition.
Okay.
How we deal with that, we have, it is a process, and we are only getting started.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the meetings go, like, we do schedule them to try to accommodate people. Like, there's usually people from Asia Pacific as well as Europe and North America on these calls, so they tend to be clustered in a certain time of day where, like, it's early morning for some and late night for others in the middle of the day. But at least everyone can kind of make it without too much inconvenience. And the calls are more for the project leadership. Lots of people contribute to these projects and have never been on one of the calls. It's all done through GitHub,
Right.
And mail lists and Slack and that sort of thing. So that's really not an impediment time zone wise. I mean, language wise, it's certainly all English, but like, it's, film and tech, like, it's like that, right? Like, if you go to a visual effects studio anywhere in the world, doesn't matter which country it is, they're speaking English at work. That's just like a fact. So, but I think a bigger hurdle is that many of these projects are really arcane, technical areas. It's the bigger threshold is like, most people have no need for color science, in their life, if they're not dealing with these kind of media problems. And so, like, there are many open source projects out there in the world where, like, anybody who uses a computer knows what that project is for. And if they have a yen to participate, they kind of have the background, as a human to know what the project's about and find some way that it's relevant to their life. That is a challenge for some of our projects, which are very specific to the way professionals do a particular thing in this industry. And it can be hard to explain. Maybe not so hard to explain, but my feeling is the best open source contributions come from people who have a stake in using it or foreseeing how it fits into their life, and that motivates them to want to improve it. Like, we're not going to pay them, unless they're working at one of the studios, but like, it's you have to feel motivated in the sense of, like, I see how this thing is a benefit. And so if it's just an abstract piece of software that, like, some other industry uses and you don't see how it fits into your life, I think that's a really high bar to clear.
Yeah. It's you mentioned color, and it's just one of my. I started an event a few years ago called the Libre Graphics Meeting, and one of the topics that was in the very first edition of that was a lecture on color. It was awesome. It's one of my all-time favorite. I did not realize there was so much in it.
It's one of those areas that I'm really glad that there are color scientists out there like Carol, because as soon as I start to open the box, I realize just how wrong I am about most of my intuition about it. It's funny that you mentioned other projects. So interestingly, in ways people may not realize, like, a lot of students or casual users using some of the bigger open source projects, like I don't know if it's in GIMP yet or not. It might be certainly in Blender. Well, let's pick Blender as an example. Blender has Open Color IO in it. It's got Open Color IO concepts, throughout at this point. The shading language is OSL, Open Shading Language, which is an Academy project at this point. It uses OpenEXR as a file format. It probably incorporates most of our projects, in a hidden way that maybe casual users don't use, but that's another way that maybe if they're already using that package, it does have relevance to their life, and they can sort of see how the pieces all fit together.
Right. Yeah, and we need users. It's a really great point. Is we need users of this stuff, because as developers of these projects, we need testers. We need people to put it through its paces and to find issues, and that's a really great way to get into the project and get familiar with these things of starting to realize, I've used Blender for years, but I didn't know that it was backed by OpenColor.io. But then you start to get involved in the project, and we release a new version, and you find all these things that change, and then to have that knowledge and make that connection that you can go back to talk to these developers about this stuff, and it's open source, and start to learn about the project and why it functions, why it's doing what it's doing, and why we changed something. And all of those things is a great way in, because like Larry said, without context, a lot of these things just that you don't even, it's hard to grok. You can't even, you have to see it working to a certain extent. Yeah.
And then that touches on something that you also discussed in prep, is that a lot of these projects really, really value contributions that are not code contributions. And I think both of you have a great example around product management and giving kind of defining features and roadmaps. And Larry, you mentioned documentation in prep. Can you talk about some of the ways that projects really value non-code contributions? Maybe Carol, start with that.
Yeah, I think Larry talks about a bunch, but there's a couple. Non-code can be the diversity and inclusion efforts. But it also, in a little bit more things that are happening right now, is that documentation efforts across the software foundation. We just overhauled OpenColor.io's documentation, and it was a subgroup of us working within the development community of OpenColor.io that, a bunch of not software engineers, a bunch of users of OpenColor.io, and then also working together with the software engineers to come up with a way to revamp the documentation, both from a technical standpoint of how it's generated, auto-generated from the C++ headers through to Python bindings, through to how it's on the web, but also what is the content of that documentation, and how does it flow, and how is it best presented to a user who's looking at this for the first time, and that kind of stuff. Someone as a developer that's really, really close to the code base can be really challenging to look at with fresh eyes of what's missing and what doesn't make sense, because we've used it for so long. And so having fresh eyes on that, and people that aren't developers, was something we looked for. We reached pretty far out into our networks of people and pulled people in to have a look at it and to give us feedback. And that's ongoing always.
Yeah, and also, someone designed your logo, and someone made the style guide for the website, and made beautiful web pages out of it. And somebody, there are so many things that the projects can use that give it that level of polish and completeness as a product. That is so much more than writing lines of code. And it in some ways it's harder to find those contributors. But they're equally, valuable in terms of making it a good ongoing project that gets adoption in the places that we want to see it go. It's not a commercial enterprise, but we have to be successful. We need to treat it as if it were a product.
Yeah, I love it. So I'd like to thank you both for joining me. Before we sign off, is there anything else that you would like to add today in terms of something that you feel is important that we haven't touched on, either of you?
We covered a lot of bases. I would love to emphasize again, a good jumping off point to learn more about this is the ASWF.io website. That's the foundation's website. You can get links to the projects. And in particular, there's this landscape.aswf.io that's got not just the projects in the foundation, but it's a little bit more of a map of the major open source projects used by the film industry. It's just a good place to see kind of the survey of like what's out there that we're using.
Which Carol linked to over there.
Yeah, that's in the chat. Yeah, I think I would echo the same thing too. And feel free to, there's, like Larry said, there's lots of like asynchronous ways to communicate with us too. So don't be afraid to jump on our Slack channel and say hello and ask questions of a follow-up. That is linked out on the ASWF website. There's also mailing lists for individual decks if you prefer to just like get information sent to you to consume or ask questions that way. Is a great, like a couple of those are pretty active. Not some more than others, you know, just depends. And I think, yeah, you know, if you're at all interested, jump on those channels and say hello. But really just like, if there's anything you take away from this, it's really just that open source is here to stay, and no longer, you know, a second-class citizen in the world of media and entertainment. And I think it's here to stay. And so as far as like, if you're looking for an area to get involved, there's, in my opinion, nothing better.
Thank you. So next week we change tack. Next week I have two people from the venture capital industry. So let me, Astasia, I should have been better prepared. But I have Astasia, let me, I am going to take a moment to gather my thoughts. And yes, so I'm joined by Astasia Myers and Imran Gori, and we're going to talk a little bit about venture capital and open source, which I hope will touch on what types of companies are interesting for venture capital investment, the ways in which venture capital can help open source projects succeed. I'm also interested in some of the ways that you know, some open source projects do not benefit from venture capital, and the ways in which market dynamics and expectations of investors can actually damage some projects or companies. So hopefully it will be an interesting conversation, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible there next week. Carol, Larry, thank you very much for joining me today. This was a pleasure, and I mean, this is an amazing industry, and it's seeing the way that things have changed in this industry in the last 20 years has been really astounding. So it's another great example of how open source can serve beyond the software industry, I guess, is one way to put it.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you
very much. Goodbye.